In this video, I will give you a quick practical overview of working with React. We will see state, JSX, and components being used inside a simple image slideshow application. This is how that application can look like and behave. As you can see, we can navigate between different images based on the image ID. Now, one way to get started quickly with React is by using an online editor, which I will be doing for now. I will be using Codesandbox.io. Another possibility would be stackblitz.com. Both of them are based on Visual Studio Code. They have project templates for React in combination with JavaScript and TypeScript, and offer automatic public hosting for demonstrations. One nice functionality is automatic formatting, which can be usually triggered by the keyboard shortcut Shift-Alt-F. This is what the start page of Codesandbox looks like. If I scroll down, I can start a React project by clicking on the React logo. Or I could explore some other options. Other options would also include React TypeScript, which we will be using later in this course. I'm going to click on React for now to create a new React project. Inside our Codesandbox, we will be creating an example slideshow component. We will see the component definition as a function. We will see internal component state. In this case, the state will be just the current image ID. And we will see JSX as a template language, as a mix of JavaScript and XML. You can follow along coding, or you can also see the finished solution, which I will post in the video description. Here we see what Codesandbox has created for us as a starting point. In this case, there's one component whose name is app. It is implemented as a function that returns some XML content. I can change this XML content and, for example, write a new heading. Which will then influence the rendering on the right-hand side. In React, I can create components as JavaScript functions. Here, I will be creating a new component called Slideshow in a separate file. For now, I'm going to pretend that this Slideshow component already exists. I will import it from a file within the same directory. And then I will include it as an XML element in my template. Note that in React, component names always start with a capital letter. Of course, this will not work at the moment because the corresponding file does not exist yet. Next, I will create this slideshow component. A component in React will usually be written as a JavaScript function. It is defined as a function that returns an XML tree. And that function will actually be called every time the component needs to be rendered or re-rendered. I will start implementing the slideshow component by creating a new file in the source directory. Slideshow.js with a capital S. And inside that file, I will create a JavaScript function of the same name. I'm also going to export it. Mostly, components will be exported as the default export from a module. Inside my slideshow component, I could return content that I would want to render. For now, I'm just going to return a div with 3 dots in it. As a next step, I could add some state to my component. useState is a so-called hook that I can use to declare a state entry in a component. And the hook is just a JavaScript function with a special meaning when called within React components. The state hook will return an array that contains the current state and the corresponding setter function. So what we see here will declare the image or image ID as a state entry, and I also have access to a corresponding setter function. Here, two JavaScript variables are created at the same time, image and setImage. The JavaScript construct that's being used here is a so-called destructuring assignment, which we will see later in more detail. Here I'm going to reproduce what we just saw. I'm assigning to the variable names img or image and setImage. And I'm doing that based on the state hook, which I can include here under the name useState. I'm going to type this via autocompletion, which will also automatically import the useState function from the React module. I have to pass a value to useState, which will be used to initialize the state. In this case, I'm initializing the image ID to 0. Based on the state of our component, we can then create so-called derived values. Usually, we should make sure that the component holds the minimal state, that it does not have any redundant data. Other values, for example the URL of the image, can be derived from state values. So if I know the image ID, I can create the image URL based on that. I'm using the service picsome.photos here to access some example images. In this case, these images will have the resolution 300 by 200, and I can specify an image by appending its ID here. So here I'm creating a derived value named image URL, which is assembled from the base URL and the image ID. Once I have some values in here, for example the image ID and the image URL, I can include those values in my JSX template. The basic rules of JSX are: an XML tag switches from JavaScript to XML mode, and a curly brace switches back to JavaScript. Here I'm going to create a heading with dynamic content. Switching from XML to JavaScript via curly braces. And I can actually show the image. Again, here I can switch from XML to JavaScript via curly braces and include the image URL as the source property. I'm also going to include an alt text, for example, Slideshow. So now this image and this heading will always be shown based on the internal state. At the moment, I can change the state by initializing it differently. In the future, I also want the user to be able to change the state by interacting with the slideshow. In order to provide some interactivity in my application, I'm going to add some buttons for navigating to different images. I'm going to start off with a button with the text Previous to navigate to the previous image. And I will also include buttons for the next image and a button to go back to the start. I can add some event listeners to those buttons via JavaScript functions. For the first button, I'm going to add an onClick event listener. And I'm going to write a JavaScript function in the shape of an arrow function. In an arrow function on the left-hand side, I'm going to put brackets with potential arguments for the function. And on the right-hand side, I could either specify a function body or a return value. Here, I'm going to specify set img to 0. For the previous button, for now, I'm going to implement a simple event handler here. Set img to img -1. And I'm doing something similar for the next button. Set img +1. And with that, I should now have an interactive application where I can use these buttons to manipulate the state, which will in turn update what is shown to the user. Right now, my code still contains a bug. The user interface would allow me to navigate to negative image IDs, which don't exist. I would have to add some extra logic to the previous button to avoid this. I could do that right in the function in the template, or I could extract that event handler to a separate function. Here I will create an extra event handler named goToPreviousImage, which I will call from the template. Depending on whether the current image ID is 0 or not, I decrement it or I do nothing. So I'm calling set img, and if the image at the moment is not 0, I will decrement it, and otherwise it will remain at 0. And then I can connect that function and call it from the UI. And I will verify if that works as expected, and it seems to be working well. It is a common practice in React to define functions within a component function. The concept is similar to defining methods inside of classes. In this small example, we've seen the basics of state, JSX, and components in React. All these three topics will be covered in much more depth during the rest of this course.